So, why are we all able to be influenced? We have talked before on this podcast about how none of us are quite as rational as we'd like to believe. Our brains rely on shortcuts, incredibly useful, incredibly predictable shortcuts, and predictable minds can be influenced. Richard Sewer spent an entire career reminding intelligence professionals that understanding how the mind works isn't just about understanding other people, it's about understanding ourselves. Because every cognitive shortcut can distort our own thinking just as easily as someone else's. So I'll start with confirmation bias, which we've discussed before. So to recap, confirmation bias was first described by English psychologist Peter Wasson in the 1960s. It is our natural tendency to search for evidence that supports what we already believe. We don't simply seek information, we seek validation. And not only do we have the tendency to search for information that supports what we already believe, we also have a tendency to notice, remember, and give weight to evidence that confirms what we already believe. So confirmation bias doesn't simply shape what information we accept, it shapes what information we even notice. Two people can watch the same debate, read the same intelligence report, or sit through the same meeting and walk away convinced it supported completely opposite conclusions. We can see this playing out almost every day in the United States. Increasingly, people don't just disagree about what a news story means, they often consume entirely different news sources to begin with. And even when they read coverage of the same event, different outlets may choose different facts to emphasize, different experts to quote, different headlines to write, or even different contexts to provide. That's not simply a question of politics, it's also a question of framing. Communication scholars have long recognized that every communicator, whether they're a journalist, an intelligence analyst, a researcher, or a teacher, has to decide what information to include, what to leave out, and how to organize it. Those choices inevitably shape how an audience understands the issue. And confirmation bias means that we're often drawn toward the framing that already feels most consistent with our existing worldview. Communication scholar Robert Entman famously described framing as selecting certain aspects of reality and making them more salient in order to promote a particular interpretation. Framing isn't inherently deceptive, it's unavoidable. None of us can communicate everything at once. The challenge is recognizing how those choices shape understanding. And if manipulation often works by exploiting predictable features of human cognition, like confirmation bias, it's pretty important for us to understand that tendency, both to avoid being manipulated ourselves and to be aware of the myriad ways that our audiences could misinterpret or be influenced by what we are trying to say based on their own preconceived notions. The good news is that psychologists have spent decades understanding and studying these heuristics and biases. The bad news is that we're all still susceptible. Then there is motivated reasoning. Psychologist Ziva Kunda explained that we are often not reasoning toward the most accurate conclusion. We are reasoning toward the conclusion we'd prefer to be true. In other words, our reasoning often behaves more like a defense attorney than a judge. It starts with the verdict and then goes looking for supporting evidence, and our identities, values, and relationships all shape what feels believable. Confirmation bias and motivated reasoning are close cousins, but they're not identical. Confirmation bias is largely about what evidence we notice, remember, and seek out, whereas motivated reasoning is about what we do with that evidence once we've found it. Confirmation bias helps us to choose the evidence. Motivated reasoning helps explain it. One influences what enters the courtroom, the other influences the verdict. But together, they're remarkably powerful. So far, we've been talking about what happens after information reaches us, how we search for it, interpret it, and justify it. But influence doesn't stop there, and sometimes it begins much earlier, simply by changing how familiar an idea feels. Our brains will often mistake familiarity for truth. I mentioned the illusory truth effect previously, but in short, it's the concept that if you repeat something often enough, familiarity starts masquerading as truth. Repetition changes belief, not because that repetition has created evidence, but because it starts to feel familiar or right. Cognitive psychologist Lynn Hasher explained this by saying that repetition creates fluency, and fluency creates familiarity, and familiarity feels true. The illusory truth effect is closely related to the mere exposure effect, which also argues that the more often we encounter something like a face, an idea, a logo, the more comfortable it begins to feel. But we know that comfort and truth are not the same thing, yet our brains often confuse them anyway. Psychologist Robert Zajanek explained this with a deceptively simple idea. Familiarity breeds liking. The more often we encounter something, even if we know almost nothing about it, the more positively we tend to evaluate it. Familiarity isn't evidence, but our brains often treat it as though it is. You can see this effect in all kinds of places. In politics, for example, incumbents or already well-known candidates often begin with one significant advantage. People recognize their names. That familiarity doesn't tell us anything about their qualifications, policies, or performance, but psychology suggests it can influence how positively or credibly they're initially evaluated. Recognition isn't the same thing as merit, but our brains don't always keep those concepts completely separate. Marketers have understood this for decades. There's a reason companies spend extraordinary amounts of money simply to have their logos appear over and over again. Think about the signs behind home plate during a baseball game, the logos around a soccer pitch, or the commercials during the Super Bowl. The goal often isn't to convince you to buy something immediately. Sometimes the goal is simply to become familiar. Then, weeks or months later, when you need to choose between two companies you've never personally used, one of them just feels more established, more trustworthy, more legitimate. Not because you've carefully evaluated it, but because you've seen it before. These two effects sound, again, almost identical, but they're actually answering different questions. The mere exposure effect asks, why do I like this? The illusory truth effect asks, why do I believe this? One makes something feel more appealing. The other makes something feel more believable. Both rely on familiarity, but familiarity can increase liking without increasing truth, or increase perceived truth without increasing liking. And sometimes it increases both. These concepts aren't unlike what intelligence analysts deal with in the availability heuristic, the idea that information that's easiest to recall often feels the most significant. Familiarity works in a similar way. What's easiest to recognize is often the first thing that comes to mind. And what comes to mind most easily can feel more credible than it actually is. Now, everything we've talked about so far has been happening largely inside our own brains. Now let's shift our attention to external relationships. Instead of asking why we think the way we do, social psychologist Robert Cialdini asked why otherwise intelligent people might become persuaded by seemingly small social cues. Enter the concept of reciprocity, which Cialdini famously identified as one of the fundamental principles of influence. When someone gives us something, even something small, we feel a surprisingly powerful obligation to give something back. Someone buys you lunch, they help you move, they give you a thoughtful gift. Most of us instinctively want to reciprocate. That's not a flaw in human psychology. It's part of what allows cooperation and trust to exist in society. But, like many of the psychological tendencies we've been discussing, it can also be intentionally leveraged. Think about the conferences you attend. You walk away with a really nice insulated water bottle, a high-quality notebook, a portable phone charger, or maybe one of those ridiculously soft hoodies that somehow becomes your very favorite sweatshirt. Now, yes, companies hand out swag because they want you to remember them. But if you stop and think about it, that one sweatshirt is actually doing several different psychological jobs at the same time. First, it's creating reciprocity. Someone gives you something genuinely useful, and even if only subconsciously, you may feel a little more inclined to stop by their booth next year to take a sales call, or at least consider them when a need arises. Second, it's increasing familiarity, mere exposure. Every time you grab that water bottle or throw on that quarter zip, you're seeing the company's name or logo again. Over time, that repeated exposure makes the organization feel increasingly familiar. And as we've just discussed, familiarity often influences both liking and perceived credibility. And finally, that swag sends a signal. Really thoughtful, high-quality swag communicates something about the organization itself. It suggests they invest in details. They're professional, they're established, they're the kind of company that has its act together. Now, none of these conclusions are necessarily true. A fantastic pair of fuzzy socks is not evidence of outstanding cybersecurity capabilities. But our brains are remarkably good at allowing one positive impression to spill over into another. Psychologists call this the halo effect. One positive characteristic, like thoughtful branding or high-quality swag, can subtly influence how we evaluate entirely unrelated characteristics such as competence or trustworthiness. And what's fascinating about influence is that the most effective examples rarely rely on a single psychological principle. They're often quietly activating several of them at once. All of these concepts address how our evaluation of the message itself is influenced, but sometimes we don't evaluate the message first, we evaluate the messenger. That's where authority bias comes in. We have evolved to learn from people who appear knowledgeable or experienced. Most of the time, that's adaptive. A firefighter tells me a building isn't safe to enter, I'm probably not going to ask for the engineering calculations. The problem is that our brains don't always distinguish between actual expertise and the appearance of expertise. Titles, uniforms, credentials, confidence, and even social status can all become shortcuts that substitute for evidence. If someone appears knowledgeable, successful, or powerful, we're often willing to assign them credibility beyond what the evidence alone would justify. And then something even more interesting happens. Once we've decided who to trust, we often start paying attention to who agrees with them. Psychologist Solomon Asch demonstrated this in his classic conformity experiments, where participants knowingly gave obviously incorrect answers simply because everyone else in the room had done so first. We often think of social proof as informational, but sometimes it's social survival. If everyone else believes something, we're more likely to believe it too. Sometimes that's wisdom, sometimes it's conformity, sometimes it's herd mentality. And when that tendency becomes embedded inside an entire group, it can evolve into something even more dangerous. Psychologist Irving Janis famously described this phenomenon as groupthink. Groupthink occurs when the desire for harmony, consensus, or belonging becomes so strong that people stop critically evaluating alternatives. Individuals start self-censoring, dissent becomes uncomfortable, and warning signs are dismissed. Before long, an entire group can become remarkably confident in an idea that no one might have defended quite so strongly on their own. For intelligence professionals, that's a particularly important lesson. Intelligence failures aren't always the result of missing information. Sometimes they're the result of groups becoming too confident in a shared interpretation of the information they already have. Consensus can absolutely be valuable, but consensus is not evidence. Sometimes everyone agrees because everyone is right. Sometimes everyone agrees because everyone is looking around the room before deciding what they think and conforming to perceived social expectations. Another school of thought approaches manipulation from a different angle. Instead of asking what part of the mind manipulation affects, it asks how influence is exercised. From this perspective, manipulation isn't a single psychological mechanism, it's a particular way of influencing another person. Philosopher Marcia Barron suggests that perhaps manipulation isn't best understood as a single behavior at all, but instead, maybe it's a tool or a device, or what Barron calls a vice of influence. Instead of asking, did someone influence another person, it shifts to asking, how did they do it? Maybe manipulation isn't influencing too much, maybe it's choosing the wrong methods at the wrong time for the wrong reasons. This suggests that perhaps manipulation is one possible and ethically problematic expression of influence. Now, so far, I think we've been assuming that manipulation is intentional. Someone has a plan, chooses a tactic, and deliberately influences another person. But philosopher Kate Nan asked if it was possible for manipulation to emerge naturally from ordinary human behavior, which is another question that philosophers disagree about. Does someone have to intend to manipulate another person in order for manipulation to occur? Or can manipulation happen almost accidentally? Which brings us back to Chelsea and Danny. I don't think either of them woke up saying, today I'd like to psychologically manipulate my partner. They were trying to avoid discomfort. The influence emerged almost naturally. Philosopher Cecil Bach argued that hidden intentions fundamentally change the ethical landscape because they deprive another person of the information they need to make an informed decision. That brings us to a very practical question. Is it manipulation if the other person is aware of what I am trying to accomplish? If both people know the objectives and they're voluntarily trying to find a mutually beneficial outcome, that's collaboration. If one person understands the game and the other doesn't, then it becomes much more ethically questionable, which would mean that perhaps manipulation isn't defined by influence itself, but by information asymmetry, by hidden objectives, diminished agency, and/or taking advantage of another person's predictable psychology without their awareness. But let's take that one step further. Everything we've discussed so far, again, has focused on changing people. Choice architecture changes something else. It changes the environment. Instead of changing minds directly, it changes the context in which decisions are made. Economists Richard Thaler and Kasten Steen popularized the idea of the nudge. Instead of changing someone's options outright, you change how those options are presented. Healthy food options go at eye level. Organ donation becomes a default. Search results are ranked in a particular order. People have to opt out rather than to opt in. None of this removes choice, but all of them influence it. Is that manipulation? Again, philosophers disagree. But choice architecture directly relates to another very relevant intelligence concept that belongs on this spectrum of influence: politicization. Politicization isn't merely advocating for a position, it's presenting, emphasizing, suppressing, or interpreting information to achieve a preferred political or organizational outcome rather than faithfully representing reality. Truth becomes secondary, outcome becomes primary. Again, the issue here is transparency. Political philosophers have been wrestling with these questions for centuries. Niccolo Machiavelli openly argued that leaders sometimes need to shape perception in order to preserve power. Intelligence professionals, of course, have a different obligation. Our responsibility is not to shape reality, but to faithfully represent it, even when the truth is inconvenient. Political philosopher Hannah Arendt also warned that one of the greatest dangers in political life isn't simply disagreement, it's the erosion of our shared commitment to factual reality. That's why politicization matters. The danger isn't advocacy. The danger is allowing the desired outcome to determine how and which data is presented. Now, there is one final concept that I want to address: coercion. Though I would argue coercion sits beyond or outside of manipulation. Manipulation generally preserves at least the appearance of choice, whereas coercion removes meaningful choice altogether. It consists of threats, violence, extortion, blackmail, consequences so dire that the decision maker feels as if no realistic alternative remains. At this point, influence has become control. So, why does manipulation bother us? Philosophers don't just disagree about what manipulation is, they also disagree about why it feels morally wrong. The third school of thought shifts the question yet again to address this. Instead of focusing on the psychology of manipulation or the tactics being used, it considers the domain or context of the influence being exercised. This school of thought suggests that perhaps manipulation isn't defined primarily by how influence works. Perhaps it's defined by what it does to the relationship between two people. Does it respect another person's autonomy? Does it preserve their agency? Does it treat them as someone to reason with rather than someone to reason around? Philosopher Sarah Buss argues that one of the reasons manipulation feels ethically troubling is that it can undermine another person's ability to govern themselves. In other words, manipulation doesn't necessarily remove your choices, but it can interfere with how you arrive at those choices. It targets autonomy. This perspective aligns with one of the giants of moral philosophy, Immanuel Kant. Kant argued that human beings should always be treated as ends in themselves, never merely as a means to someone else's objective. Now, that's a wonderfully philosophical sentence, but let me translate it into plain English. People are not tools. They're not chess pieces. They're not problems to be solved or obstacles to be maneuvered around. They're autonomous human beings with their own goals, values, and dignity. When we begin treating another person primarily as a way to accomplish our objective, whether that's getting the promotion, closing the sale, winning the argument, or ending the relationship, we've crossed into ethically dangerous territory. Notice what Kant is not saying. He's not saying we shouldn't influence people. Of course we influence people. We've talked about this already. Teachers influence students. Parents influence children. Leaders influence organizations. Analysts influence decisions. That's unavoidable. The question isn't whether we influence people, it's how. And that actually reminds me of something that really didn't occur to me until after I'd already decided to call this episode The Art of the Jedi Mind Trick. Now, to be clear, I am not comparing intelligence professionals to Jedi, though after enough years in both the government and the private sector, I do think it's fair to say that a lightsaber would be remarkably useful in dealing with certain kinds of paperwork. What I'm suggesting is that Star Wars poses an interesting ethical question about influence. Now, if you're not a Star Wars fan, a Jedi mind trick is a fictional ability that allows a Jedi to subtly influence another person's perceptions or decisions. The classic example is when Obi-Wan Kenobi waves his hand at a pair of stormtroopers and calmly says, "These are not the droids you're looking for." The stormtroopers immediately agree and let him pass. We tend to think of it as a clever bit of movie magic, but if you stop and think about it, it's actually a fascinating ethical thought experiment. Obi-Wan isn't persuading the stormtroopers. He's not presenting evidence. He's not negotiating. He's not collaborating. He's reaching directly into another person's decision-making processes and changing the outcome. By many of the philosophical frameworks we've been discussing today, that's manipulation. And yet we don't generally walk away from that scene thinking, wow, Obi-Wan is kind of a villain. Why? Because the Jedi aren't defined by their ability to influence people. They're defined by the extraordinary restraint they're expected to exercise. The Jedi Code emphasizes discipline, selflessness, service, and control over one's emotions. The Force itself isn't portrayed as inherently good or evil. It's simply a source of power. The ethical question has always been how that power is used, when it's used, and why it's used. That's actually a pretty sophisticated moral framework. The power isn't the point, the restraint is. In other words, the Jedi weren't admirable because they could perform mind tricks. They were admirable because they were expected to know when not to. And if that sounds familiar, it should, because that's remarkably close to what Kant was arguing over 200 years ago. Kant wasn't worried that people influence one another. We all do. He was worried about whether we treat another person as a thinking, autonomous human being or merely as an instrument for achieving our own objective. Notice something fascinating here. Kant isn't evaluating the outcome. He's evaluating the relationship between two people. That's an entirely different moral framework. Under Kant's view, even successful influence can become ethically problematic if it stops respecting another person's autonomy and begins treating them merely as a means to an end. Philosopher Patricia Greenspan also suggests that perhaps manipulation isn't inherently wrong in every circumstance. Maybe its morality is contextual, depending on the situation and the relationship. For example, suppose your spouse is having an absolutely terrible day, so out of kindness, you decide not to bring up a difficult conversation until tomorrow. Have you manipulated the situation? Maybe. Was it unethical? Well, probably not. Now imagine your physician withholds information because they think you'll make the quote-unquote wrong decision if you're told everything. That feels very different. Or imagine an intelligence analyst selectively presenting evidence because they already know which policy outcome their intelligence consumer prefers. Again, very different. The behavior may look similar, but what's changed is the relationship. And with relationships come expectations. We expect honesty from our doctors. We expect objectivity from intelligence analysts. We expect advocates to advocate. We expect defense attorneys to present their client's best case. We expect advertisers to persuade us. Historically, in the US, we've also expected a free press to inform the public as accurately and transparently as possible, to investigate those in positions of power, and to help citizens make informed decisions. That doesn't mean journalists don't have perspectives or make mistakes. Every profession is made up of human beings, but the ethical standard we hold them to is rooted in the role they're expected to play in a democratic society. The ethical standards shift depending on the role each person or institution has agreed to occupy. The very same behavior can feel perfectly acceptable in one relationship and deeply unethical in another. From this perspective, context, transparency, expectations, and trust are all crucial elements in evaluating manipulation. Which brings me back to something I hinted at earlier. Maybe manipulation isn't one single thing. Maybe it's not even a single point on our continuum. Maybe manipulation is what happens when influence begins to erode one person's autonomy, when transparency begins to disappear, when the relationship no longer supports the tactics being used, or when we stop treating another person as someone to reason with and begin treating them as someone to reason around. And I think that's a much harder question than simply asking, did someone get another person to do what they wanted? Because influence isn't the problem. We influence each other every single day. The question isn't whether we'll influence other people. The question is how. Whether we preserve their agency, whether we're transparent about our objectives, whether we treat them as partners in reasoning or merely obstacles to be maneuvered around. Now, there's more to the Chelsea and Danny story that I have intentionally left out. And before I tell the rest of that story, I should probably mention that I wasn't actually present for this conversation. But I can say that everything I'm about to tell you comes directly from the two of them, and their stories were remarkably consistent. About 6 months after they broke up, they ran into each other at a mutual friend's barbecue. At first, it was exactly as awkward as you'd expect. A little small talk, a little catching up. Then Danny casually mentioned that he'd finally increased his retirement contributions. Chelsea laughed. "Oh, so you were listening." Danny joked that she, quote-unquote, made it pretty hard not to, since it was all she would talk about. And he noted his 401k was actually doing pretty well, though he had been starting to feel like every one of their dates was a meeting with his personal financial advisor. In their lighthearted banter, Chelsea decided to call him out. "You were faking it, weren't you?" Danny feigned ignorance. Faking what? The eggs, Chelsea pointed out. The eggs? Danny, you made fresh pasta from scratch on a semi-regular basis. You actually own a pasta drying rack. There wasn't a universe in which I believed you suddenly forgot whether eggs belong in the refrigerator. Danny burst out laughing and agreed that that was a fair assessment. She also asked him about shrinking her sweater, which Danny would neither confirm nor deny. Chelsea said, I knew it. And then Danny stopped laughing. Wait, you seriously knew? Chelsea laughed. Not in the moment, but I figured it out. Danny had to pause for a second, and then, of course, he asked the obvious question. Well, then why didn't you say anything? Chelsea shrugged and said, because I thought you were trying to convince me that you didn't want to build a future together. And Danny, of course, stared at her, and he said, I wasn't. And Chelsea had to clarify and said, you weren't. And Danny said, of course I wanted a future with you. I just wasn't ready to have that conversation yet. I loved our life. I loved how spontaneous we were. I thought the minute that we started talking about marriage, all of that was going to disappear. Chelsea had to agree. She said, I was pretty happy with where we were at too. I wasn't asking for a ring or anything. I just wanted to know that we were headed in the same direction. Danny had to laugh and said, well, that would have been useful information. And then, of course, Chelsea laughed with him. And somewhere in the middle of all of this laughter about how spectacularly they had misread each other, they also realized something else. They had actually understood each other's psychology almost perfectly. What they'd misunderstood were each other's intentions. And as intelligence professionals, we make that distinction all the time. Capability is not the same thing as intent. Someone can be capable of doing something without intending to do it. And Chelsea and Danny both knew each other's capabilities. They just weren't really sure of each other's intentions. Both of them had picked up on subtle clues and thought maybe they understood exactly what the other person wanted, but neither of them ever tested their assumptions. They simply filled in the blanks themselves. Eventually, at the barbecue, they did exactly what I had been telling them to do all along. They talked honestly about what they actually wanted, not what they assumed the other person wanted. And they discovered something almost embarrassing. They had spent weeks trying to influence one another when one honest conversation would have accomplished more than all of their carefully orchestrated psychological chess. And a year later, they got married. So I'll ask again, was that manipulation? Honestly, I still don't know. I think reasonable people could disagree. But maybe that's the wrong question. Understanding people is a superpower, the same understanding of human psychology that allows us to become better teachers, better leaders, better negotiators, better therapists, better intelligence professionals, better thinkers, and even better relationship partners, also gives us the ability to influence other people. That knowledge is morally neutral. What matters is what we choose to do with it. There's a line that most of us associate with Spider-Man's Uncle Ben. With great power comes great responsibility. Now, the intelligence professional in me feels obligated to point out that the attribution is a little messy. The sentiment predates Marvel by centuries, and we could trace it back to Churchill or the French Revolution or even the Gospel of Luke. But I think I'm content in letting our favorite web-slinger's uncle have the last word, because understanding people is a kind of a superpower, and with great power comes great responsibility. And I'd argue that is the real art of the Jedi mind trick. Not getting someone else to think what you want them to think or to do what you want them to do, but understanding the responsibility that comes with understanding how people think. Thanks for listening to The Unknown Knowns. If this episode made you think or rethink, share it with a colleague or friend who's ready to level up their tradecraft. Subscribe for more short, sharp conversations about the art and science of professional judgment. Until next time, stay curious, stay grounded, and keep turning intelligence into impact.